Chapter 67. You. Seeing the scholar holding the servant girl's hand and leaving with an indifferent expression, the anger on Zheng Zimo's pretty face became even stronger. However, seeing that many people had already noticed them, she still had some scruples in her heart. She snorted coldly and didn't chase after them. That night on the stage, this scholar rushed up and grabbed her hand as if he had gone crazy. She was really scared and subconsciously thought of him as a lecher. However, after thinking about it carefully, she felt that he didn't seem to want to take advantage of her. However, thinking about how he left without even saying a word of apology, she naturally felt a bit angry. For the past few days, he had been thinking about this matter and always felt uncomfortable. When he saw that scholar who didn't understand etiquette again, all the accumulated anger was vented out. She originally thought that if he seriously explained and sincerely apologized, this matter could be resolved. However, who would have thought that he would ignore her like this, let alone have the slightest intention of apologizing? "I'm so angry." She caressed her chest a few times and only then did she feel a little better. Drunken ink, what happened? Seeing her like this, the women all looked at each other. For some reason, Ruoqing took a step forward and looked at her. "We'll talk about this later. Sister Ruoqing, where's the osmanthus cake I asked you to bring for me?" Zheng Zimo shook her head and suppressed the anger in her heart. She wanted to use a happy matter to divert attention. When she was unhappy, she would eat. This had always been her habit. This? Ruoqing's expression froze and an awkward expression appeared on her pretty face. Seeing her expression, Zheng Zimo said with a bitter expression, "You can't have forgotten, right?" "Ahem, Zimo, you should tell us what happened just now," the older woman said with a dry cough. "It's just a lecture." "What's there to say?" Zheng Zimo glared fiercely at Li Yi's departing figure again. She gritted her teeth and deliberately emphasized the word, lecture. "Young master, what is a lecture?" On the other side, the servant girl scratched her head curiously and looked up at Li Yi. Just now, that beautiful big sister said that the son-in-law was a lecher, and seemed to be very angry, but what was a lecher? Until now, Xuanhuan had not figured it out. "You're just a little girl. Don't ask." Li Yi rubbed her head and said, "Little girl, home?" A puzzled expression appeared on the little servant girl's face again, but this time she roughly understood Li Yi's meaning. She lowered her head and rubbed the corner of her clothes, murmuring softly, "Xuanhuan is already 15 years old, not young anymore. Son-in-law?" She raised her head and was about to ask something when Li Yi picked up a piece of pastry from the table and stuffed it into her mouth. "Try this." She made a few muffled sounds, but the servant girl knew that the son-in-law didn't seem to be willing to answer the question just now. After swallowing the pastry, she didn't speak anymore. What exactly did the lecture mean? Once he returned to the stronghold, he would ask his mistress and find out. That's right, that beautiful big sister just now, she seemed to have seen her somewhere before. The young girl sat there with one hand propping up her chin. She glanced in that direction from afar and just happened to see the side of Zheng Zimo's face. After a slight pause, she seemed to remember something. Her beautiful eyes suddenly widened and her small mouth also opened in surprise. At this moment, the figure of that beautiful big sister finally overlapped with a certain figure in the little servant girl's memory. That painting scroll that the son-in-law had her lock up in the cabinet, wasn't the woman drawn on it the beautiful big sister just now? For a moment, the little servant girl seemed to have discovered something incredible, and her heart immediately stirred. Previously, she had thought that the son-in-law probably liked the woman in the painting very much, which was why he had her carefully put it away and locked it in the cabinet. There were many things that the little servant girl didn't dare to ask. She could only think in her heart, just what kind of story did the son-in-law and that beautiful woman have? But every time she thought of this, there would be a sour feeling in her heart. Fortunately, apart from that hidden painting, the son-in-law was no different from before. After a long time, her heart gradually relaxed. And after seeing the woman in the painting today, the young girl's heart finally began to panic. Although she didn't understand what that beautiful big sister said, she and the son-in-law did indeed know each other. She was so angry. Was it because the young miss had snatched the son-in-law away? The little servant girl didn't want to think in the worst direction, but because of her worry, she couldn't help but guess. What if the son-in-law abandoned Xuanhuan and left with that beautiful big sister? If the son-in-law left, the young miss and second miss would definitely be very sad, but the one who would be the most sad would still be Xuanhuan. If the son-in-law was willing to bring Xuanhuan along. If that was the case, then Xuanhuan would definitely be overjoyed. No, Xuanhuan couldn't leave. If Xuanhuan also left, there would only be the two young misses left at home, and they would be even more sad. It would be best if the son-in-law didn't leave, and everyone could still be together like before. This was the best ending that the little servant girl could think of. No one knew when the poetry meet had officially begun. It should have been long prepared, and not long after, someone had already made a few poems. Upstairs and downstairs, there were people who gathered and evaluated each other. And at this moment, Li Yi heard a bad news from the gossip. Today's competition was limited to a few poetry meets. Even if someone made a good poem, it wasn't within the scope of the competition. At most, they would only receive a few words of praise from others. In other words, those few poetry meets were the absolute protagonists of today. Li Yi and the rest of the people here were just there to express their opinions on the poems that others brought out. Of course, to Li Yi, what he cared about was not the poem or the qualification to participate in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. If he didn't have the qualification to participate in the poetry written test, then even if he copied out a good poem, he would not have the chance to get the 100 silver taels. At this moment he was a little regretful. He should have checked the almanac before going out today. It must be written that it was forbidden to go out and it was better to stay at home. Not only did he embarrass himself in front of those girls, but it was also bad luck to run into that lady Zuamo. Now, even the last bit of comfort in his heart was gone. He had wanted to leave with Xuanhuan, but the fruits and pastries here were really quite delicious. It had taken a lot of effort to get here, and it was not worth it to just leave like this. He should eat to his heart's content first. With this in mind, when he turned his head, he saw the little servant girl resting her chin with one hand. He didn't know what she was thinking, but the expression on her pretty face changed. Sometimes it was full of worry, and sometimes there was a smile at the corner of her mouth. There was even a moment when tears appeared at the corner of her eyes. Just as Li Yi was wondering what kind of drama was playing out in the little servant girl's heart, Zheng Zuemo's somewhat surprised voice sounded from the other side. What? My osmanthus cake was eaten by that lecher. After knowing what had just happened, Zheng Zuemo's eyebrows rose, and anger once again appeared on her pretty face. Her gaze was like a knife as she looked in a certain direction. Li Yi sensed something and looked up. When their gazes met in the air, sparks seemed to shoot out. At the same time they snorted coldly and turned their heads. Chapter 68. Actually, that scholar doesn't look like a lecher. I'm afraid there must be some misunderstanding. The slightly older woman from the Yunying Poetry Club said after a moment of silence. Zheng Zumo already understood that the scholar didn't do it on purpose, but his attitude of disregard just now still made her very angry. Although her impression of him as a lecher had changed, she still couldn't calm the anger in her heart. The woman named Wan Ruoqing saw the expression on Zheng Zumo's face and was slightly surprised. That scholar looked gentle, so how did he anger her to this extent? Thinking back to what just happened, she gradually had a guess. He came to ask for pastries from her because he thought she was a servant here. She couldn't help but look down at her clothes. Was she dressed like a servant today? Whether it was because of this or because of Zheng Zumo, she was more or less curious about the scholar. When she looked up in that direction, she just happened to see the scholar pick up a piece of preserved fruit. After a few breaths, he picked up a piece of pastry. After a few breaths, he drank a cup of tea and picked up another piece of preserved fruit. It seemed like he was more interested in these things than the poems made by the scholars. What a strange scholar! Seeing the scholar who was completely focused on the food in front of him, Ruoqing's cherry lips parted slightly and thought to herself. Not long after, someone else came up with a new composition which caused a round of applause. Several women got up from their seats and walked over to the other side. Li Yi sat there and would occasionally hear a few poems made by the so-called scholars around him. What followed was a round of praise from the crowd. Li Yi couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth when he heard those people praising those poems as if they were masterpieces that had been passed down from generation to generation. What good poems! These so-called excellent Mid-Autumn Festival poems were just a few people looking at the moon and feeling high. When it came to Mid-Autumn Festival poems, the ones that appeared in one's mind should be raise one's head to look at the bright moon, bow one's head to think of home, raise one's cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3, may people last forever, 1,000 miles together. Compared to those poems that had been passed down for hundreds of generations, what was the one being praised now? The trace of disdainful mockery on Li Yi's lips was caught by Zheng Zumo, who had been staring at him from not far away. I wonder what kind of good poem he can make. He's quite arrogant. He snorted coldly. In his heart, he had already regarded Li Yi as an arrogant student with no talent at all. Watch. Xuanhuan's surprised voice rang in Li Yi's ears. He quickly turned his head and saw the little servant girl covering her head. A young man opposite her was covering his chest. The front of his shirt was wet. Sir, I'm sorry. The servant girl hurriedly lowered her head and apologized with a panicked expression. The young man clearly didn't have a good temper and was splashed with tea. He was about to scold her when he looked up to see that the person in front of him was such a pretty girl. His expression froze for a moment before an indescribable light flashed through his eyes. It's fine, it's fine. The young man smiled and reached out to help her up. At this moment, a figure blocked in front of him. The young man frowned and asked, "Who are you?" "Son-in-law." Xuanhuan was like a child who had done something wrong and stood behind Li Yi. "Son-in-law?" The young man looked at Li Yi suspiciously and asked, "This lady, is this brother's servant girl?" "This servant girl is insensible and has caused trouble for brother." Li Yi cupped his hands and spoke apologetically. "It's just a small matter." The young man looked at the servant girl and a strange light appeared in his eyes. He then looked at Li Yi and asked with a smile, "Brother, you look very unfamiliar. Are you a scholar of Qing and Fu?" Li Yi noticed the way he looked at Xuanhuan. Seeing that he was clearly trying to get close to him, Li Yi furrowed his brows and casually said a few words. Just as he was about to lose his patience, the young man suddenly changed the topic. He pointed at the two girls standing behind him and said, "What do you think of my two servant girls?" Li Yi raised his head and glanced at him, not knowing what the other meant. These two girls were about 17 or 18 years old. They should be at the age of innocence, but their brows showed tiredness and their eyes were dim. They were far from Xuanhuan's liveliness. The young man smiled slightly and said, "To tell you the truth, I am quite interested in brother's servant girls. If brother is willing to part with them, I am willing to use these two servant girls in exchange." When the two girls standing behind the young man heard this, their expressions changed slightly. They raised their heads and glanced at Li Yi, and a glimmer of light appeared in their eyes. "Son-in-law." Hearing this, the servant girl's face paled. She immediately grabbed the corner of Li Yi's clothes tightly, afraid that Li Yi would trade her out. "My apologies, I have no interest in brother's servant girls." Li Yi raised his head to look at her and replied indifferently, "I'm being sincere. Why do you have to keep me at arm's length, brother? To tell you the truth, my father is the Anshi district magistrate. If brother has any problems in the future, I might be able to help." Seeing that Li Yi had no intention of agreeing, the young man was not in a hurry and continued to speak with a smile. Qing, and Prefecture City was under the jurisdiction of the Anshi district. Although there were many people in the Prefecture City who could suppress the Anshi district magistrate, in the eyes of most people, this title was enough to intimidate them. On the surface, the young man's words sounded like a negotiation, but in reality, it was a threat. What he secretly wanted to express was, "I like this girl. You have to change her no matter what. I am the son of the county magistrate. It's up to you to decide if you want to change her or not." However, while the title of the district magistrate's son could intimidate others, it could not intimidate Li Yi. He had slept in the prince's mansion and visited a brothel with the prince's son. What was a mere district magistrate's son to him? The young man didn't try to hide his words just now. Between scholars, exchanging maids and concubines was something that had happened since ancient times. To them it was a very normal thing. At this moment, many people had already gathered around, smiling and speaking up for the young man. The one named Lu is not a good person. If that girl ends up in his hands, she will probably be defiled again. I wonder if that scholar, will he trade? The one named Lu's father is the district magistrate. I'm afraid that scholar, sigh. Not far away, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society sighed. Their expressions were unsightly. After all, they were also women. Of course, they could not stand to see women being exchanged like goods. One watching also sighed. Although she was very angry about this, it was not something they could change. This guy, he probably won't trade, right? Although she hated Li Yi to the core, for some reason, Zheng Zumo had an indescribable confidence in him. She is just a servant girl. If you are willing to part with her, I'm afraid it will become a good story in today's poetry meeting. At this time, a young man who seemed to be somewhat famous came up and looked at Li Yi with a smile. He said, "I am Su Wenian, the president of the Dongli Poetry Society. Brother Lu is my friend, so please give me some face." Li Yi gave him a bright smile and said, "Sell your mother." Off. The next moment, the scene became quiet. Zheng Zumo spat out the tea she had just taken. Chapter 69. Zheng Zumo hurriedly wiped away the water stains on her clothes. Deep shock surged onto her pretty face. At this moment she was somewhat suspicious. Had she heard incorrectly just now? In any case, the scholar was still a scholar. How could he say such unreasonable words? But when she turned her head, she saw that Wan Ruoqing and the other women had the same expression as her. They were clearly also shocked. Only then did she confirm that what the scholar had said just now was indeed those 4 words. Her mouth opened slightly. When she looked at the scholar standing in front of the young servant girl, her gaze changed for the first time. This young master, how can he? Wan Ruoqing's lips parted slightly. It was unknown what expression was on her pretty face. Scholars placed great importance on their manners. She had never seen a scholar say such vulgar words. She had always been disgusted by such things. But for some reason at this moment she couldn't feel any disgust towards the scholar. If the scholar really succumbed to the young man's despotic power, she would most likely be truly disappointed. She didn't think that not only did the scholar refuse, but the way he refused was so unique. The women who belonged to the Yuning Poetry Club beside her all had their lips curled up. They wanted to laugh but had to forcefully suppress it to avoid losing their composure. It was truly difficult. But at this moment, when they looked at the scholar again, they instantly felt he was much more pleasing to the eye. Sell your mother. Seeing the scholar in front of him say these words with a smile on his face, the young man named Su Wentian's expression was first startled, then immediately turned red. He pointed a finger at Li Yi, his lips trembling, unable to say a word. He was a scholar, and the people he usually interacted with were the same. As a famous scholar in Qingyan Fu, there were great scholars in their conversations and there were no commoners. But which great scholar would open his mouth and say, "Sell your mother"? They were all scholars with status. Could they speak more civilly? Even though he was angry and wanted to curse back regardless of his status, he couldn't think of any curse words that could rival the 4 words just now. His face became even redder. It was really difficult for a scholar who had been reading the books of sages since he was young to compete with Li Yi, a veteran from the 21st century, in cursing. Vulgar man. Such filthy words. Unbearable. Unbearable. What a disgrace. You're a scholar in vain. Around Su Wentian, the scholars who belonged to the Dongli Poetry Society were also stunned for a moment, but then their faces changed greatly, and they started to criticize Li Yi with livid faces. Everyone here is a scholar. Even if you don't agree, everyone will try to persuade you. Wouldn't it be fine as long as you agree? Why do you have to scold others? In the face of these people's accusations, Li Yi's expression did not change. After all, compared to the scolding methods in the future, which often revolved around your mother, 18 generations of ancestors as the radius, genitals as the weapon, and sexual fantasies as the skill, which radiated 360 degrees and overturned the entire family tree, curses such as disgraceful, unworthy of being a scholar, and even son of AB*TCH, did not have the slightest impact on him. Li Yi had restrained himself just now because he was worried that this kind of cursing skill would be too powerful. If he really angered some of them to death here, he would inevitably be sued. At the very least, he really didn't need to be angry with these guys. On the surface they were all geniuses and scholars, but secretly they were thieves and prostitutes. The things they did were dirtier than the previous one. Some of the dirty things could even be put on the table to be traded, but in their eyes, it was extremely normal. Especially when the scholar named Su Wentian asked him to do him a favor with a smile, Li Yi felt that the 4 words he gave him couldn't be more suitable. It was simple and crude, but the effect was remarkable. The Dongli Poetry Club was the most popular candidate for the first place today, attracting the attention of many people. It didn't take long for the abnormality here to attract many people's attention. Many people in the surroundings looked over, and several figures also walked down from the upstairs. Su Wentian cherished his reputation after all. No matter what the result was, it wouldn't be a good thing for him. With a cold snort, he turned around and left without saying a word. Beside him, several people of the White Dew Poetry Club also glared at Li Yi with vicious eyes, showing disdain to associate with him. "I'll remember you." The young man who claimed to be the county magistrate's son glanced at Li Yi gloomily and said coldly. Behind him, 2 young girls' eyes flashed with a trace of sadness. They glanced at the little maid standing behind Li Yi with envy, then followed the young man and left silently. "Young master, it's all Xuanhuan's fault." After these people left one after another, the little maid pulled the corner of Li Yi's clothes and said while sobbing. There were tears at the corners of her eyes. "It's okay, it's not Xuanhuan's fault." Li Yi smiled and rubbed her head as he said softly. "But they all said that, son-in-law." The young maidservant raised her head, 2 teardrops rolling down from her gem-like eyes. From what she heard, the words those people used to scold son-in-law were already very unpleasant to hear. "Oh." Before she could finish her words, Li Yi stuffed a piece of pastry into her mouth. Li Yi pinched the little maid's pretty face. The little girl pouted and blinked innocently at him. Chapter 70. What happened up there? When the women came up to ask, the older woman had already handed over the paper raft. She sighed and said, "This poem was written by Xuanhuan just now. Everyone take a look." A woman took the paper raft from his hand and in the next moment she began to recite. Although the others were all women, they were all known as talented women in Qing and prefectural city. After hearing a few lines, they could tell that the standard of the poem was far above that of ordinary people. What, is this poem well written? Zheng Zumo's knowledge of poetry was not deep. Unless it was something like, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, that ordinary people could distinguish, she had no ability to distinguish ordinary poems. Su Wenqian's Mid-Autumn Festival poem is indeed much better than Fang Zhou's, Xuanhuan said slowly with a complicated expression on her pretty face after the woman finished reciting. She could roughly judge the standard of the poem just by listening to it once. She had also heard the Mid-Autumn Festival poem written by Su Wenqian last year. She didn't expect it to go up another level this year. She was afraid that it would shine in the poetry meet tomorrow night. Sister Ruoqing, can your poem beat Su Wenqian's? Zheng Zumo looked at her and asked. She was very concerned about this. The Union Poetry Society's victory or defeat today would determine whether or not they had the right to participate in the true Mid-Autumn Festival tomorrow. If they won, she could enter with them and perhaps she could see that person then? I also didn't think that Su Wenqian would have such skill in Mid-Autumn Festival poem. I'm afraid I cannot compare. Wan Ruoqing shook her head and said with a wry smile. Based on this poem, Su Wenqian has already won today's competition. The older woman of the Union Poetry Society sighed and said. Although they didn't want to admit it, from ancient times until now in the path of poetry, women were always inferior to men. Hearing this, Zheng Zumo's pretty face showed disappointment. If the Union Poetry Society couldn't win, then they didn't have the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival. Naturally, she wouldn't be able to see the talent called Li Yi. These days he could only keep the questions about that novel painting method in his mind. That person seemed to have appeared out of thin air and then disappeared. No matter how others searched, they couldn't find any information related to him. Zheng Zumo could only place all her hopes on tomorrow's poetry conference. With his talent, he shouldn't be absent from that kind of poetry conference. Knowing what she was thinking, Wan Ruoqing turned to look at her and said, "Even if we can attend the poetry competition tomorrow, we may not be able to see the person we want to see." Zheng Zumo understood everything that Wan Ruoqing had said, but this was still a ray of hope. If they lost today, even this hope would be gone. She turned her head in disappointment and saw that the scholar was holding a paper raft in his hand. After looking at it, the corners of his mouth curled up, and the expression she had seen before once again appeared on his face. This kind of expression was a little similar to the one she had when she saw the paintings of people who were not good at painting. Casually throwing the paper raft on the table, she said something to the young servant girl, and the two of them walked in the direction of the door. Gritting her teeth, she walked over to where the scholar had been, picked up the paper raft he had thrown away, and moved her gaze to it. What was written on the paper raft was the poem that Su Wenqian had been praised by everyone. For a moment, the expression on Zheng Zumo's pretty face became very complicated, but it quickly turned into determination. She chased after the scholar's back. "Zumo," Wan Ruoqing called her from behind. Seeing that she didn't seem to hear, a puzzled expression appeared on her pretty face. She put down Su Wenqian's poem and followed. "Miss Zumo?" On the way she met a man who cupped his hands to her, but Zheng Zumo didn't pay attention to him. When she quickly walked past, the man's smile froze on his face. His gaze followed the direction of her back. The scholar and servant girl had already walked to the door. If he had known that this poetry conference didn't allow outsiders to participate, Li Yi wouldn't have wasted so much time here. After tasting all the fruits and pastries inside, he planned to go back with Xuanhuan. Wait. When he reached the door, a voice suddenly came from behind. Li Yi looked back and saw that the woman who had called him a lecher was walking over quickly. This woman, there's no end to it. Li Yi frowned slightly, subconsciously thinking that this woman was here to cause trouble. "Xuanhuan, let's go." As a man, he didn't want to fight with this crazy woman. Li Yi took Xuanhuan's hand and was about to leave, but Zheng Zumo quickly ran a few steps and blocked in front of them. Xuanhuan looked at the beautiful woman in front of her, and a vigilant expression appeared on her face. She couldn't help but move closer to Li Yi. "What do you want now?" Li Yi looked at her and asked with a frown. He was obviously a little unhappy. As long as you do me a favor, we can write off all our previous grievances. Zheng Zumo looked straight into Li Yi's eyes and said through gritted teeth. No. Li Yi said lightly and took Xuanhuan's hand, intending to leave. He really didn't care about writing off all their grievances. Whether or not they would see each other again in the future was another matter. Why would he ask for trouble? Moreover, something that could make this woman put down her pride to ask for his help was probably not simple. He wasn't familiar with her, and strictly speaking, they had some minor grievances. Why should he help her? Chapter 71. Miss Wan is too polite. I didn't take this matter to heart. The voice of the woman in front of him was extremely gentle, giving off a feeling of a spring breeze. Li Yi cupped his hands towards her and said with a smile. What do you mean you didn't take it to heart? I clearly took it to heart. Zheng Zumo watched as this scholar spoke coldly to her but smiled at elder sister Ruoqing. She felt extremely bitter and wanted nothing more than to pounce on him and bite him. It took her a great deal of effort to restrain this impulse. If you don't mind, you can call me Ruoqing. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him and said with a smile. Li Yi glanced at Zheng Zumo again and gave her a meaningful look. You? Zheng Zumo's beautiful eyes were spitting fire. She almost couldn't suppress the impulse in her heart. Although Li Yi didn't say it explicitly, she understood his eyes. The meaning was, look at how gentle, polite, and likable she is. Then look at yourself. As a woman, don't you feel ashamed? Li Yi nodded and said, if Miss Ruoqing doesn't have anything else, I will leave first. The beautiful woman seemed to hesitate for a moment before saying, to be honest, I do have something that I would like to ask for your help with. Li Yi's expression froze. He clearly didn't expect Ruoqing to say something like this. His words just now were just a polite greeting. His intention to leave was already very obvious. A normal person would wave goodbye. Why didn't this Ruoqing follow the rules? Miss, please speak. Although Li Yi was curious, he still smiled and said. He had a good impression of this Ruoqing. Li Yi had imagined countless times how women in ancient times should look like. Virtuous and virtuous, suitable for home and home, refined and elegant. No matter what kind of imagination he had, of course, it didn't include smashing a solid wooden table with his bare hands, cutting off a tree trunk as thick as an arm, pointing at others like a shrew and calling them lechers. However, when he really came to this world, Li Yi found that reality was still very different from his imagination. Until he met Wan Ruoqing, the image of an ancient woman in his heart suddenly became clear. It was as if the woman had traveled through thousands of years and walked out of a painting. She smiled and curtsied to him, and a soft voice sounded. Greetings, young master. In Li Yi's mind, this was the style that an ancient woman should have. For this reason alone, Li Yi would listen to what she had to say. Not to mention he had just eaten her food. If he refused before she finished, Li Yi was too embarrassed to do such a thing. Ruoqing knows that this is a bit presumptuous, but I wonder if young master could compose a mid-autumn festival poem for the Yuning Poetry Club? I would be very grateful. Wan Ruoqing looked up at him. Mid-autumn festival poem? Li Yi stilled. Wan Ruoqing's request was a bit unexpected. If she wanted someone to compose a poem, she should find the famous scholars in the Qing and prefecture. He was just a nobody. Why did she have to find him? Zheng Zumo also paused slightly. Could it be that Sister Ruoqing also saw that this scholar was not ordinary? Wan Ruoqing nodded and then quietly waited for his answer. Just now, when everyone was appraising Su Wentian's poem, only this scholar was joking with the little servant girl. When Wan Ruoqing walked past him, she just happened to see him throw the paper with Su Wentian's poem to the side, discard it like an old shoe. She faintly heard him say in a low voice, raising a cup to invite the bright moon facing the shadow to form 3 people. Then he didn't say anything else. When these words entered her ears, an extremely clear image appeared in her mind. Drinking alone under the moon, facing only the bright moon and her own shadow. With just this sentence, the artistic conception had already spread out. Wan Ruoqing's attainments in poetry had already reached a higher level. Just from this incomplete poem, she could see that this scholar not only had a unique way of doing things, but in terms of poetic talent, Su Wentian's generation was far from his. However, with her personality, she would not take the initiative to ask for help. She lost. She could only blame herself for not having enough literary talent. Only when Zheng Zumo ran out and she heard her conversation with the scholar did she realize that Zheng Zumo had also seen through some things. After thinking about it, she still made this presumptuous request. After all, tomorrow's poetry meet was not only what Zheng Zumo was looking forward to. At the Chinese Valentine's Day poetry meet a month ago, she was the one who picked up the sky prayer lantern that fell from the sky. The poem, Immortal on the Magpie Bridge, that was written on it was also spread by her. Even now many people still thought that the poem was written by her. In these days, in the eyes of everyone, there had been an inextricable connection between her and the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. However, Xuanhuan knew that she would not be able to compose such a poem in her lifetime. She had the same reverence and admiration towards the scholar named Li Yi as many women. If she could meet him once, she could fulfill one of her life's wishes. "Miss, are you here to participate in tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet?" Li Yi looked at her and asked in confusion. Xuanhuan smiled and said, "To be honest, the reason the Union Poetry Club wants to win today's competition is because there is someone we want to meet at tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet." Seeing Ruoqing's beautiful face reveal the adoration of a fan towards her idol, Li Yi was extremely surprised. Could it be that Xuanhuan, Zheng Zumo, and the other women of the Union Poetry Club were all going to the meet to meet a certain famous scholar? Thinking of this possibility, Li Yi suddenly felt a strong sense of envy towards that unknown fellow. There was no need to mention Xuanhuan. She was so beautiful, had a good personality, and seemed to be very talented in literature. As for that Zheng Zumo, although her personality was terrible, her looks and figure did not lose to Xuanhuan at all. Then there were the women of the Union Poetry Club. Scholars were so popular these days. Even these talented women were charmed. Who knew how many more ignorant girls were fans of that fellow? Li Yi always thought that the career of being the husband of a stronghold was very promising. There were beautiful sisters at home, and when he had nothing to do he could bring beautiful servant girls everywhere. But now, compared to that person, Li Yi suddenly felt that the difference was like heaven and earth. Sigh, the heavens are blind. Doesn't he just know a few lousy poems? What's so great about it? Even a woman like Xuanhuan can't help but like him? Li Yi sighed in his heart, and his face showed an extremely regretful expression. In the eyes of Zheng Zumo and Xuanhuan, this was naturally a sign of rejection. "Forget it, Sister Ruoqing, let's go. I don't want to beg this lecture." Zheng Zumo raised her eyebrows and glared fiercely at Li Yi. She didn't want to be bullied by him anymore, so she pulled Xuanhuan's hand and was about to leave. Xuanhuan's pretty face also showed a look of disappointment, but she was not surprised. They didn't know each other, so it was indeed a bit too much for her to make such a request. It was also when she and Zheng Zumo were about to leave that the scholar's voice finally came over. "Since tomorrow's poetry conference is of great significance to Lady Ruoqing, how can I refuse?" Chapter 72. A gentleman helps others achieve their goals. Zheng Zumo turned to look at Li Yi. No matter how she thought about it, she couldn't associate the word gentleman with the scholar in front of her. After all, no gentleman would say "your mother" every time he opened his mouth, but no matter what, he finally agreed. However, when she thought about how he rejected her without even thinking when she asked him for help, and how he agreed so easily when it was Sister Ruoqing, she couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sourness in her heart. She looked at Li Yi with resentment. "Thank you, young master." Seeing that Li Yi agreed, Ruoqing's pretty face showed a joyful expression. "Don't rush, I have another condition." Li Yi spoke again. "What condition?" Zheng Zumo looked at him and her eyes suddenly became vigilant. Although she came from a brothel, she was a pure person who only sold her skills and not her body. If Li Yi made any excessive demands, she wouldn't agree even if she didn't ask him to compose a poem. Li Yi glanced at Zheng Zumo, who was obviously thinking too highly of herself and didn't pay attention to her. He turned to look at Ruoqing and asked, "Miss Ruoqing only wants to win today's competition so that she can participate in the mid-autumn poetry meet, right?" Xuanhuan nodded but didn't understand what Li Yi meant. At this time, Li Yi looked at her and said, "I heard that the winner of today's poetry club will receive 100 taels of silver as a reward. I don't want anything else, just this 100 taels of silver." Helping was helping, but he still had to ask for the benefits he deserved. The girls from the Union Poetry Club and Xuanhuan wanted the right to participate in the mid-autumn poetry meet. Li Yi wanted the 100 taels of silver. Everyone took what they needed. This was a win-win situation. Xuanhuan was startled when she heard this. She looked up at Li Yi and nodded. That's how it should be. Even though 100 taels of silver was not a small amount to them, they didn't care about that. That was just a bonus for winning the competition. If they lost the competition, they wouldn't even have the right to participate in the mid-autumn poetry meet, not to mention the 100 taels of silver. She didn't need to ask for the opinions of those women and could help them make the decision. Miser. All you think about is money. Zheng Zumo cursed in her mind. Her disdain for Li Yi was obvious. Now that the conditions were settled, The three of them turned around and walked back into the hall. Along the way, Ruoqing walked beside Li Yi and said something to him. Slightly behind them, Zheng Zimo raised her head and glared at Li Yi from time to time. If her gaze was a knife, Li Yi would have been cut into pieces by now. The servant girl followed behind them. She looked at Li Yi for a while and then secretly peeked at Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo. She was still a bit uneasy. Upstairs, several people looked down. After a moment of shock, they spoke with some confusion. "Who's that man with Lady Wan and Lady Zuemo? He looks unfamiliar. Probably a friend of Lady Wan. I saw him with the people from the Union Poetry Club." "It's him. Why would Lady Wan make friends with such a vulgar person?" Among these people there were those who didn't know Li Yi. At this moment, they were shocked that Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo were so close to a man. Some had just seen him scold Xuanhuan away. They were even more shocked. How did this person get together with Ruoqing, the famous talented girl of Qing'an Prefecture, and Zheng Zimo, the top artist of the Jade's Yard? They didn't even have the mood to make friends with such a vulgar person and a refined scum. Could it be that those two girls just happened to like this kind of style? At this time, the women of the Union Poetry Club were gathered in a corner. The poems on the table in front of them were the ones that everyone had already read. Even though they were unwilling, they had to admit that in terms of poetry, they were far inferior to those men. Could it be that we are destined to have no fate with the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet? A girl said unwillingly. All the girls sighed and remained silent. At this time, Ruoqing and Li Yi walked over. "I'll leave everything to you, young master." Ruoqing bowed to Li Yi and said with a serious expression. "Ruoqing, this is..." Seeing the scholar again, confusion appeared on the women's faces. When the older woman came forward to ask, Li Yi had already picked up a brush. He dipped it in ink and was about to write when he seemed to remember something. He turned back to look at Ruoqing and handed the brush to her. He said, "Let me read. Miss Ruoqing, you write." Ruoqing naturally didn't know that Li Yi was afraid that her words were too ugly and would be laughed at. She thought that this young master was very thoughtful. Since this was a work that represented the Union Poetry Club, she naturally had to write it herself. She took the brush from Li Yi's hand. Under the slightly confused gazes of the women, Li Yi had already begun to speak. "A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no companionship. It's a poem?" The women exclaimed softly. Their eyes were full of surprise, but they still didn't understand what was going on. Can this guy really do it? Zheng Zimo looked at him, still uncertain. After all, she was only guessing just now. If this scholar was just an arrogant student without any talent, then wouldn't everything she had done just now be in vain? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3. It was also at this time that the second line of Li Yi's poem was recited. In an instant, the expressions of the rather talented women froze. In the next moment their expressions changed. Seeing that their expressions had all become very solemn, Zheng Zimo was startled. Then she looked at Li Yi and a thought of disbelief rose in her heart. Could it be that his poems are really that powerful? Since the moon cannot be drunk, the shadow follows me. Temporarily accompanying the shadow of the moon, joy must last until spring. Li Yi's voice continued. Beside him, Ruoqing picked up the brush and began to write. Neat and beautiful lines of hairpin-style small regular script appeared on the paper. My song lingers in the moon, my dancing shadow is messy. When awake we are joyful, when drunk we are separated. Forever unrequited we meet again in the clouds. When Ruoqing finished the last word, Li Yi spoke again. This poem is called Drinking Alone Under the Moon. Zheng Zimo stood to the side in a daze. She saw that the gazes of the people around her seemed to be attracted by the poem on the paper and didn't move away for a long time. When she turned to look at the calm scholar again, her expression began to change. After a while, the women from the Union Poetry Club finally moved away from the paper. They looked at each other and an indescribable light appeared on their faces. Congratulations, Brother Su. Brother Su has great literary talent. We admire you. With Brother Su's poem, you will definitely shine at the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet tomorrow. I will congratulate Brother Su in advance. You flatter me, you flatter me. Somewhere upstairs, Xuanhuan was accepting the crowd's compliments. He kept saluting back, already forgetting the unhappiness that had just happened. His entire person felt like he was floating. Since the Qishi Poetry Meet a month ago, he had been completely suppressed by the White Dew Poetry Club. Only now did he finally turn the tables and return to the peak of his life. Brother Su's poem is truly breathtaking. Tomorrow, I'm afraid you'll be able to compete with Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhaoji to see who's better. Opposite Su Wentian, a scholarly robed young man laughed. Brother Su exaggerates too much. I still have some self-awareness. There are many scholars in Qing'an Prefecture. Even those who are proficient in poetry would not dare to say they can beat these two. Hearing this, Su Wentian shook his head and said. The young scholar smiled and was about to speak when a paper raft came from the side. His eyes inadvertently swept over. His gaze could not move away. Chapter 73. Brother Su, Brother Su? Su Wentian looked at the young man who had suddenly fallen into a daze. After calling him twice, the other still didn't come back to his senses. He couldn't help but feel very puzzled. Moving forward in time, a little earlier, a pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no companionship. Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes three people. Since the moon cannot be drunk, the shadow follows me. Temporarily accompanying the shadow of the moon, joy must last until spring. Forever unfeeling and traveling, we will meet in the clouds. Ruoqing this poem, as Ruoqing wrote, drinking alone under the moon, on the xian paper with graceful handwriting, the expressions of the talented women of the Yuning Poetry Club gradually changed from puzzlement to shock. After she stopped writing, the older woman turned to look at her and opened her mouth in disbelief. How does this poem compare to what Fang Wentian did? Zheng Zumo had seen the change in the expressions of the women just now. She couldn't help but ask impatiently. Hearing this, the older woman's expression became solemn. She said, how can the light of a grain of rice compete with the brilliance of the moon? What virtue and ability does Fang Wentian have to compare with this legendary poem? Legendary poem? Zheng Zumo's cherry lips parted slightly. It was as if a bolt of lightning had flashed through her mind. That unreasonable guy's poetic talent was actually at such a high level? If this poem were to spread, I'm afraid that all the scholars of our Jing kingdom, no matter when or where, as long as they raise a cup to drink, they will inevitably recite, raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes three people. A young woman's beautiful eyes became dazed as she murmured. The performance of the talented women was not out of Li Yi's expectations. One had to know that this drinking alone under the moon, even among all of Li Bai's works, was considered the best of the best. Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes three people, was a line that had been passed down for thousands of years. Who was Li Bai? He was an existence that stood at the peak of the ancient literary world. Any random poem he threw out was enough to scare people to death. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face was also filled with uncontrollable excitement. When she heard the poem, she only guessed that this young master should have some talent, but she never thought that his talent would be so high. Putting aside her personal feelings, the standard of this poem was already comparable to the Immortal Magpie Bridge. Of course, in Wan Ruoqing's heart, she still preferred Immortal Magpie Bridge. Putting aside the relationship between her and that poem, in the Jing kingdom for various reasons, the development of poetry was more prosperous than that of poetry and was more popular. As for poetry, it was indeed very popular during the previous dynasty. However, for the past 100 years, the literati of the Jing kingdom still preferred writing lyrics. Because of this, although Drinking Alone Under the Moon had a very high standard, but in terms of influence, it would not surpass Immortal Magpie Bridge. However, if this poem was compared to something like Fang Wentian, it would be making a mountain out of a molehill. When the shock in their hearts subsided a little, everyone's gazes couldn't help but look at Li Yi. For them, through a poem, they could see the character of the poet, and even what he was thinking when he wrote the poem. Drinking alone under the moonlight with no one close to him, from lonely to not lonely, then from not lonely to lonely. His poetry was broad-minded, and there was no room between himself and the world. What kind of breadth of mind was this? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, facing the shadow of three people. What kind of desolation would come after this kind of self-satisfaction? The scholar's expression was calm, but the hearts of the talented women were already filled with a myriad of emotions. Being stared at by so many women, Li Yi truly felt a little guilty. He coughed lightly and the pretty faces of the women blushed slightly. Only then did they realize that as women, staring at a man like this was a very unreasonable action. He hurriedly returned to his seat and copied the poem from just now onto a few pieces of paper, passing it around among the crowd. Not far from Li Yi, Zheng Zumo sat there. She didn't know whether to be happy or angry at this moment. She was happy because there was hope of winning today's competition and participating in tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet. She was angry because the heavens were blind and gave that unreasonable person such a good talent. As for the servant girl standing next to Li Yi, Although her head was still dizzy, she was very happy inside. It seemed that the son-in-law's poem had scared these sisters. Last Qishi, son-in-law had even written a poem on Xuanhuan's prayer lantern. It was called, something immortal? At last month's Qishi poetry meet, Fang Zhou suppressed Su Wentian. If not for the immortal magpie bridge, that appeared out of nowhere, I'm afraid he would have been the champion that day. But today he was overshadowed by Su Wentian. If the White Dew Poetry Club doesn't have a better poem, I'm afraid they will lose this time. That's not surprising. In the field of poetry, it has always been difficult to distinguish who is better. Fang Zhou is good at Qishi poems, and Su Wentian's poem about the moon is very outstanding. It is very suitable for this mid-autumn poetry meet. It is no surprise that Fang Zhou lost to him. Speaking of which, the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Club can't be underestimated. I wonder if they have any good poems tonight? Of course they do. Lady Wan's poem about the moon is above Fang Zhou's, but it is still inferior to Fang Wentian's. Somewhere on the first floor, a few scholars raised their cups and drank, judging the outstanding works of today's poetry meet. In the end, they are just women. In that case, the winner today is definitely the Dongli Poetry Club. With this poem, I'm afraid Su Wentian won't be unknown at tomorrow's meet. A man in green said with a sigh. He took a paper raft from a passing servant and wanted to see which poetry club had new works. That's not necessarily true. After all, there are many scholars in Qing and Prefecture tomorrow. There will be no lack of good works. Whether Su Wentian can make the list depends on his luck. As they talked, they didn't realize that one of them was silent for a long time. A shocked expression gradually appeared on his face. I hope Su Wentian can make a name for himself tomorrow. This way we can boast about him in the future and share his glory. A scholar said with a smile. Before he finished his second sentence, a voice suddenly came from beside him. Everyone wait. This voice was slightly louder, and the scholar swallowed the words he was about to say. The few of them looked at him with puzzled expressions. The scholar in green still had a shocked expression as he slowly handed over the paper raft in his hand. After the few people took it, they moved their heads closer. After a few breaths, their expressions all changed. Back to the upper floor. Brother Su? Brother Su? Su Wentian didn't know how many times he called until he reached out and shook his shoulder. Only then did the young man wake up. Brother Su, what has happened to make Brother Su so absent-minded? When he looked up, he saw Su Wentian looking at him with puzzlement. A complicated expression appeared on the young man's face. He looked at Su Wentian and handed over the paper raft in his hand. Brother Su, you, take a look. Chapter 74. Su Wentian accepted the paper raft he handed over. Seeing the expression on his face, he suddenly had a bad feeling. His gaze swept over the paper raft. Not long after, a hint of surprise appeared on Su Wentian's face. Then it darkened. Who wrote this poem? He turned his head to look at the man named Su. There was no longer any trace of joy on his face. The handwriting is hairpin-style small regular script. It must have been written by one of the talented women from the Yunying Poetry Society. This poem was probably written by them. The man named Su pointed to the handwriting on the raft. He reached out and patted Su Wentian's shoulder. He sighed and said, Brother Su, you don't have much time left. Su Wentian knew what he meant. If he couldn't create a poem that surpassed the standard of this poem in a short amount of time, they would lose today's competition without a doubt. They would also lose the right to attend the poetry competition tomorrow. However, the words of the youth surnamed Su still made him want to curse out loud. What did he mean by he didn't have much time left? Even if he was given another day, a month, a year, or even a lifetime, he still might not be able to create such a poem. If he had this kind of ability, how could the title of the foremost scholar of Qing and Fu fall onto the heads of Yang Yanzhou and Xinjiao? Raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3. This line of the poem was like an insurmountable mountain lying in front of Su Wentian, making him feel a strong sense of powerlessness just by looking at it. Unsurpassable. Impossible, this is impossible. No one in the Yunying poetry competition could create a poem like this, not even that xuanhuan. Su Wentian's expression was ugly as he said, this poem doesn't seem to be written by a woman at all. A pot of wine among the flowers, drinking alone with no friends, no family, no friends. Just this point alone is enough to satisfy them. Furthermore, forever marrying without love, meeting in the clouds. How can a woman have such breadth of mind? Su Wentian was very talented. After reading the poem a few times, he had an idea. He said, let's go take a look. I don't believe this poem was written by the Union Poetry Society. The youth surnamed Su also had the intention to go downstairs, so he nodded and followed behind him. At this moment, the location of the Union Poetry Club downstairs was already abnormally crowded. Not long after the poem spread, people started to walk over. Their expressions were complicated, but there was also a hint of admiration. There were so many scholars here, but they couldn't even compare to a few women. This inevitably made the men lose face, but that poem was really well written. At this time, no one mentioned Su Wentian's name. The excellent mid-autumn poem he had just composed was also forgotten by everyone. The exuberance of young Mrs. Talent truly causes all of us to feel ashamed and resentful. After today, I'm afraid the title of the most talented woman in Qing and Prefecture will belong to Miss Wan. She's not just the most talented woman. If this poem were to be presented at tomorrow's poetry competition, I guarantee that even Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao would have to concede defeat. We are fortunate enough to be able to witness such a legendary poem. We have no regrets. All the girls heard were words of praise, far more than what Fang Wenyan had just said. There were even people who compared the top 2 scholars in Qing and Prefecture to her, and came to the conclusion that they were far inferior. All of this was because the standard of this drinking alone under the moon was truly high to the heavens. The talented women of the Union Poetry Club were surrounded by the crowd. Their faces were full of excitement. Naturally, there were also many people surrounding Wan Ruoqing. Hearing their praises, her face was slightly embarrassed. She glanced at Li Yi guiltily. Seeing him smiling at her, her face became even redder. That poem, it was clearly written by the son-in-law. The little servant girl at the side pouted and muttered in a small voice. In her heart, she was angry for the son-in-law. When Su Wentian and the youth surnamed Su came downstairs, they were blocked outside the crowd and couldn't squeeze in. Everyone make way, don't push, who stepped on my foot? Damn it, which shameless scoundrel touched my butt? The two of them squeezed in with great difficulty and instantly attracted the dissatisfaction of the crowd. When they turned their heads and saw that the person who came was Su Wentian, their expressions became strange and they made way for him. After all, if it wasn't for the sudden appearance of a super dark horse, the person who had the last laugh today would have been Su Wentian. Gaining and losing, the taste in his heart was probably not good at all. Everyone also wanted to see his reaction. It would be best if he would give a speech about not receiving the award. Under the gaze of the crowd, Su Wentian walked next to the women of the Union Poetry Club. He first raised his hands in greeting and said, "This, drinking alone under the moon, is the peak of mid-autumn festival poetry. I, Su, am full of admiration." At this point, the topic suddenly changed. I wonder which talented woman of the Union Poetry Club wrote this poem? Among the women, the face of the younger girl changed slightly. Even though it quickly returned to normal, Su Wentian still caught it. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile. There was indeed something fishy about this. Is it Lady Wan? Su Wentian looked at Wan Ruoqing with a smile that was not a smile. No. Wan Ruoqing shook her head. No matter how much she wanted to win today's competition, she couldn't say such untruthful words. Could it be Lady Zumo? Su Wentian turned to look at Zheng Zumo and asked. I don't have such literary talent. Zheng Zumo shook her head and said. Then, there's no need to ask. This poem was written by this young man. It was obvious that Su Wentian was deliberately trying to embarrass them. Before he could finish, Wan Ruoqing pointed at Li Yi beside her and said. Li Yi looked at Wan Ruoqing helplessly and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This young lady is really honest. As soon as Wan Ruoqing's voice fell, there was an immediate uproar. What? This poem wasn't written by Lady Wan. That scholar can actually produce such a masterpiece. If that's the case, this poem can't be counted as written by the Union Poetry Society? What a pity. If this wasn't the case, this poem would have won the competition tomorrow. Seeing the astonished expressions on everyone's faces, Fang Wentian revealed a smile. He looked at Wan Ruoqing and said, If I remember correctly, other than the poetry clubs, outsiders are not allowed to participate in this competition, right? The faces of the few women from the Union Poetry Society changed slightly. There was indeed such a rule in today's competition. However, every poetry society would invite a few scholars that they were familiar with. If they could compose a good poem, it would count as a poem from their own society. This was something that everyone had a tacit understanding about. However, rules were rules. If they were serious, poems written by outsiders naturally did not count. Thinking of this, their hearts all sank. What if this young man isn't an outsider? At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the side. Chapter 75. The leader of the Yunying Poetry Society, the slightly older woman, walked over. She looked at Su Wentian and said, "What if this gentleman is not an outsider?" "What do you mean, Miss Xiao?" Su Wentian asked with a frown. "To be honest, this gentleman has long joined the Yunying Poetry Society. His poems can naturally represent us," Zhao Yunru said slowly as she looked around at the crowd. When these words were spoken, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society, including Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zimo, all froze. "This gentleman, when did he join the Yunying Poetry Society?" Li also stilled. "When did he join the Yunying Poetry Society? How come he didn't know?" At this moment, Li Yi saw the woman winking at him discreetly, and he immediately understood what was going on. Yes, from now on he was a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. At the same time, an uproar immediately came from the surrounding crowd. "How is this possible? He is a man. The Yunying Poetry Society has always only been women. When has a man ever joined?" Clearly Zhao Yunru's words just now had a great impact on them. The Yunying Poetry Society was formed by the talented women of Qing and Prefecture and had never accepted any men. Where did this person come from? The Yunying Poetry Society has always only been women. This is something everyone knows. "Miss Xiao, please do not joke." Su Wentian still had a faint smile on his face. Zhao Yunru's words were clearly just a temporary measure. However, she used the wrong method and could not be exposed. Hearing this, Zhao Yunru looked at the crowd with a slight smile and said, "When did we say that the Yunying Poetry Society only allowed women to join?" The smile on Su Wentian's face froze. The surrounding hubbub also gradually quieted. A sliver of shock floated onto everyone's faces and they revealed thoughtful expressions. Very quickly they realized that from beginning to end, the Yunying Poetry Society seemed to have never said such a thing. It was only because of the name of the Yunying Poetry Society and the fact that the members were all women that they naturally had their previous thoughts. However, the leader of the Poetry Society had personally refuted the rumors and denied that only women could join the Yunying Poetry Society. What else could they say? No wonder when this scholar came in, he was so familiar with Lady Wan and the women of Yunying Poetry Club. It turns out that he is also a member of Yunying Poetry Club. The Yunying Poetry Club actually allows men to join. It turns out that we have been mistaken all along. This way, this poem can naturally represent the Yunying Poetry Society. If they can participate in tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, with this person there, Yang Yinzhou and Xin Zhao will have to die on the spot. I'm afraid the title of the #1 scholar in Qingyan Prefecture is about to change hands. That's not necessarily the case. Although this poem is good, every time Xin Zhao writes a poem, it will be widely circulated in the brothels and music halls. No matter how good the poem is, it can't be compared to it. Just now, everyone had only thought that Zhao Yunru's words were a ploy. However, when they thought of how the scholar had headed straight for the Yunying Poetry Society when he came in and behaved intimately with Wan Ruoqing and the others, they thought that they already knew each other. There was no longer any doubt in their hearts. The two scholars who had followed Li Yi and stood at the back of the crowd and stared dazedly at him. They murmured, "So that brother really does know Lady Wan. He is also a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. You hid it so well from us." Su Wentian's expression was dark. He had not thought that one sentence from Zhao Yunru would turn his attack into nothing. That scholarly scum was actually a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. This was far beyond his expectations. However, he was not willing to give up just like this. Tomorrow's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet would be his time to shine and amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. He would not allow anyone to ruin it. Raising his head to look at Zhao Yunru, he gritted his teeth and said, "Even so, this poem does not count because today's competition is competing in Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival, not Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival." Hearing Su Wentian's words, Zhao Yunru was first slightly startled. Then she said with slight anger, "What's the difference between poetry and poetry? Even the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet has always been about poetry." Hearing this, Su Wentian said lightly, "But today we are competing in Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival. Lady Zhao cannot deny this, right?" Zhao Yunru was momentarily speechless. She could not find a reason to refute. At that time, when the few poetry societies set the rules, they did not consider this kind of situation. This was because talents who were good at writing poems were very rare. At the poetry gathering, poems usually took up more than 90% of the time. Even if there were poems, they were all mediocre. Therefore, There was no difference whether they competed for Mid-Autumn Festival poems or Mid-Autumn Festival poems. In the end, one of the poems would be the winner. She had never thought that Su Wentian would take advantage of this loophole. This way, this Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival that would be passed down through the ages would not count today. After Su Wentian finished speaking, all of the surrounding candidates frowned. This Su Wentian is too narrow-minded. Even if this person has some talent, he will not be able to become a great person. I never thought that Su Wentian would be this kind of person. That day when the rules were set, they actually neglected this point. Otherwise, this situation would not have happened. Even though Su Wentian is somewhat shameless, but this time he is really standing on the side of reason. What a pity. If this piece of work won in the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, we would also be honored. What a pity. After today, Su Wentian's image in the eyes of many scholars would definitely plummet. However, at this moment he could not care less. If he could make a name for himself in the poetry meet tomorrow, then he would gain much more than he would lose. So, this means that the winner today will definitely be Brother Su? The youth with the surname Lu, who had just clashed with Li Yi, laughed and looked at Li Yi and the other women from the Yunying Poetry Society. Zhao Yunru and the other women from the Yunying Poetry Society were filled with anger, but they could not speak. Zheng Zumo was somewhat anxious. Her heart was filled with great disappointment after the initial surprise. Did he still fail in the end? Young master, this is all Ruoqing's fault. I did not explain this to you beforehand. Wan Ruoqing looked at Li Yi apologetically. Her eyes were slightly red as she spoke softly. If she had thought of this earlier, the current situation wouldn't have happened. Yunying Poetry Society, what a pity. There is no need to be too pessimistic. After today, just this poem alone will be enough for that scholar to become famous in the entire Qing and prefecture. The Yunying Poetry Society will also be known by everyone. Su Wentian has lost the support of the people. Although he won, he lost. Although the Yunying Poetry Society lost, it was still glorious. The rules could not be changed. Although the scholars present did not like Su Wentian's actions, they could only sigh at the Yunying Poetry Society. Putting aside this poem, Su Wentian's Mid-Autumn Festival poem truly surpassed everyone else's. I'm afraid I have to congratulate Brother Su in advance. The youth with the surname Lu smiled and saluted Su Wentian. Brother Lu, it's too early to say that. Su Wentian clasped his hands together and said humbly. Li Yi let out a long sigh as he watched the two of them hypocritically echoing each other. Young master, Wan Ruoqing looked up at him apologetically. Just as she was about to speak, Li Yi waved his hand. He looked at her and said somewhat reproachfully, you should have said earlier if you wanted a poem or not. Chapter 76. At first, Wan Ruoqing had said that she wanted to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem, but the only one Li Yi could recite was Su Shi's Shuidiao. However, Shuidiao had stood at the pinnacle of Mid-Autumn Festival poems for thousands of years. Once this poem came out, all other poems were useless. The standard was so high that it could scare people to death. In this small competition, Li Yi really could not bear to take it out. After all, that kind of poem, if he took it out, there would be one less poem. Just for 100 silver, it was really not worth it. When he came in, he talked with Wan Ruoqing and found out that both Mid-Autumn Festival poems and Mid-Autumn Festival poems could be used. The first thing he thought of was Li Bai's Drinking Alone Under the Moon. This was also one of the few poems that Li Yi could recite without cheating. The other one was Raising My Head to Look at the Moon, Lowering My Head to Think of My Hometown. Although there were only 4 lines and quiet night thoughts, it became Li Bai's most influential work. Every child who started to learn ancient poetry, the first line they had to recite was, the moonlight in front of my bed, I suspect it to be the frost on the ground. Thus, in Li Yi's heart, this poem was far more important than Drinking Alone Under the Moon. He was not willing to take it out. He did not think that this stupid poetry competition would only allow people to compose lyrics and not poems. If that was the case, it would be better to just call it a poetry competition. What a waste of people's time. You should have said so earlier. Wan Ruoqing raised her head and looked at him. Suddenly, some hope rose in her heart. Young master, what do you mean? Li Yi actually did not have any other intentions. The earlier he finished here, the earlier he could go home for dinner. I'll have to trouble Miss Ruoqing to write again. Li Yi looked at her and smiled. At this time, Ruoqing finally understood the meaning of Li Yi's words. He actually wants to compose another Mid-Autumn Festival poem on the spot. For poetry gatherings like the Double Seventh Festival or the Mid-Autumn Festival, the theme was unusually clear. The poetry gatherings were limited to the Double Seventh Festival and Mid-Autumn Festival poems. The scholars who participated in the poetry gatherings usually started preparing long before the event. They even spent months to polish their poems and refine every word. Only then would they be able to produce the stunning moment of the poetry gatherings. If they were asked to compose lyrics on the spot, even the so-called foremost scholar of Qing'an Prefecture would most likely only be able to come up with a mediocre piece. After Drinking Alone Under the Moon was rejected, it was practically impossible for them to come up with another Mid-Autumn Festival poem that could surpass Su Wentian's in a short period of time. They didn't have any hope at all. Miss Ruoqing, Li Yi saw that Wan Ruoqing did not move, so he waved his hand in front of her eyes. After Wan Ruoqing came back to her senses, she glanced at Li Yi again and hurriedly picked up the brush. She spread out another piece of rice paper and stood quietly by the side, waiting for Li Yi to speak. Although she didn't know why this young master didn't write on his own this time, she was only puzzled for a moment before she immediately listened to his arrangements. Her action naturally aroused the curiosity of the crowd. What is Miss Wan doing? Is she going to write another Mid-Autumn Festival poem? Even if she really did it, it's impossible for her to surpass Su Wentian. Many of the candidates sighed in their hearts. No one thought highly of Wan Ruoqing. After all, even the Mid-Autumn Festival speech that Su Wentian had meticulously prepared was suppressed by him. How could he possibly beat the other party with his improvisation? When Su Wentian saw this, a mocking expression appeared on his face. If Ruoqing's meticulous preparation for the past few months was enough to threaten him, the lyrics she wrote on the spot probably wouldn't be as good as the one she just wrote. Ruoqing. The women of the Yunying Poetry Society also guessed the same. Zhao Yunru looked at her and opened her mouth. In the end she could only sigh. Only Zheng Zimo looked up at Li Yi. She had seen everything that he had whispered to Wan Ruoqing. Partridge sky. Just at this time, Li Yi spoke lightly. Partridge sky? Some of the candidates' expressions froze. It's a poem, someone immediately said. So the lyricist was that brother. Everyone immediately understood. However, because of this, their confidence in the Yunying Poetry Society decreased a bit. Even though poetry was often mentioned together, there were great differences in both style and rhythm. To study one of them required a great deal of time and energy, not to mention someone who was a master of both poetry and poetry. Such a talent would have long been famous throughout the world. There was no way they wouldn't recognize him. The standard of Drinking Alone Under the Moon was already high enough to make them gasp in surprise. If a poem written on the spot could beat Su Wentian, then Su Wentian wouldn't be the only one who would feel ashamed. Su Wentian's smile remained on his face, his heart full of confidence. Not to mention that the person in front of him was only an unknown scholar. Even if the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture wrote a poem on the spot, he wouldn't be afraid. When the time came, the work would be mediocre again. Let's see how they clean up the mess. When Li Yi's voice came, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society paused. Then they abruptly raised their heads, hope rising in their eyes. It was the same scene as before. Could this young master once again reverse the situation? Zheng Zimo looked at the scholar's calm expression. For some reason, her heart suddenly calmed down. It was also at this time that Li Yi's voice once again clearly reached everyone's ears. Blowing through the lingering smoke into the night wind, a bright moon hangs above the curtain. When the night wind blew through the thin mist and the bright moon hung outside the curtain uncontrollably appeared in their minds, the expressions on their faces froze. Because the road is far, the person is still far. Even if our hearts sleep together, we are not together. Li Yi's voice continued. It was as if Ruoqing was using graceful and agile hairpin-style small regular script to transcribe the words onto the Xian paper. Deep in love, deep in thought, the blue clouds return without a trace. Only like in a previous life, love separated mandarin ducks in 2 cages. After reading Lu Yong's Remembering Your Charm, Li Yi picked up the tea beside him and took a sip. Only then did he realize that the venue had suddenly quieted down. The little servant girl blinked her large eyes and unconsciously moved closer to Li Yi. The atmosphere was eerily quiet and the young girl was somewhat afraid. A moment later, a sound finally came from the venue. Su Wentian turned his head. The expression on his face was indescribable. He opened his mouth but did not say anything in the end. He pushed through the crowd and walked out without a word. Only when his figure disappeared through the door did an uproar suddenly erupt from the crowd. Using a long and slow poem to describe parting and yearning. Although it is plain and unadorned, it is incisive. It seems plain and straightforward, but it shows even more the sorrow of parting. I did not think that brother would be a master of both poetry and poetry. I am impressed. In an instant, many people with complicated expressions cupped their hands towards Li Yi and said, Su Wenyan knows that he is not as good as brother and has already left. Today's competition is won by the Yunning Poetry Club. Although the process was complicated, in the end they still won. All the women of the Yunning Poetry Club had expressions of joy on their faces. Occasionally they would use their beautiful eyes to secretly examine Li Yi. His entire poem was filled with the sorrow of parting. This young master was probably thinking of his lover. They just did not know which woman was so lucky to be able to receive the favor of this young master. At this time, in the hearts of these talented women, this handsome young master who was a master of both poetry and poetry had long surpassed Yang Yanzhou, Xinjiao and the others. He was almost at the same level as the Li Yi of the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Chapter 77. Although this Remembering Your Charm wasn't Lu Yong's best work, but as the saying goes, where there's water one can sing willow poems, Lu Sanbian's talent wasn't just for show. Any random piece he took out wasn't something any random cat or dog could compare to. Su Wenqian's literary talent was unknown, but he knew his own limitations. This could be considered an advantage. After Su Wenqian left, the people of the Dongli Poetry Club also left dejectedly, including some people who were close to Su Wenqian. They did not have the face to stay here anymore. After all, Su Wenqian was too cocky just now. Unfortunately, the higher he climbed, the more painful the fall. Not only did it cause the Dongli Poetry Club to lose the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival, Su Wenqian himself would not be able to stand among the other scholars in the future. If it wasn't for young master today, it would be us who left just now. The leader of the Yunning Poetry Club, a woman called Zhao Yunru, brought over a tray covered with a red cloth. She bowed slightly and said, These 100 taels of silver are for today's champion. Please accept them and don't refuse. Thank you, Miss Zhao. I won't stand on ceremony then. Li Yi smiled as he took the tray from Zhao Yunru. The smile on his face became even brighter. He really had nothing to decline. This 100 taels of silver was his ultimate goal. If it wasn't for the Yunning Poetry Club, he wouldn't be able to get the silver no matter how good his poems were. Similarly, if it wasn't for him, the Yunning Poetry Club wouldn't be able to have the last laugh and obtain the right to participate in the Mid-Autumn Festival. Everyone took what they needed, no need to stand on ceremony. A poetry competition like this should be held a few more times. Throwing down poems, taking the money and running, wouldn't that be much easier than carrying candied fruits all over the streets? Of course, Li Yi only thought about it in his heart. Such a good thing couldn't be encountered every day. It was more reliable to do business honestly. After all, business could prosper the country. He wrapped the silver in the red cloth, stuffed it into the little servant girl's arms, and rubbed her head as he said, Xuanhuan, take the silver. Let's go home. 100 taels of silver was about 7 or 8 caddies. It wasn't heavy for the little servant girl. Xuanhuan had already experienced son-in-law's ability to earn money and was already used to it. She hugged the silver to her bosom, her little face full of smiles. In addition to the silver in her bosom, the servant girl also held tightly onto 2 folded pieces of paper. On the paper were 2 poems written by the young master. Xuanhuan was illiterate and could not remember those 2 poems. Just now when those people were passing them around, the little servant girl secretly kept 2 pieces and planned to bring them home to show Miss in 2nd Mississippi. Just now, the elder sister said that the poem written by the son-in-law was about the sorrow of parting. It was about longing for one's beloved. Could it be that he was talking about Miss? If eldest Miss knew, she would definitely be very happy. That time, the son-in-law did not return for the whole night. Everyone thought that the son-in-law had run away. Young Miss did not show any reaction on the surface, but that night she was actually like Xuanhuan, unable to sleep the whole night. The young Miss would also be shocked when she saw the son-in-law's poem. The little maidservant thought to herself, after all, it was not a waste of time. Li Yi's mood was also a little better. Just as he was about to leave with Xuanhuan, he saw Zheng Zimo standing there. His footsteps paused slightly and after a moment of thought he walked over there. Zheng Zimo saw him walking over, and the expression on her face slightly froze. She subconsciously asked, What are you going to do? Li cupped his hands at her and said, Miss Zimo, I did not mean to offend you that day. I just mistook you for a friend of mine. If I disturbed you, I hope you will not blame me. Because of his mood just now, Li Yi's attitude towards Zheng Zimo was not so friendly, but after all, it was his fault. In this era, holding a woman's hand was already a very serious offense. It was understandable for the other party to call him a lecher. Of course, these two sentences at this time were not asking for forgiveness, but just expressing his attitude. After all, they had stood on the same front and fought together. A mistake was a mistake. Even if they would not have a chance to meet again in the future, some words were said, and their thoughts would eventually be more clear. Hearing Li Yi's words, Zheng Zimo's expression was slightly startled. He would actually apologize to her. This was something Zheng Zimo had never thought of. After experiencing what had just happened, Zheng Zimo was already very clear in her heart that even though this scholar was unreasonable, his talent was shockingly high. At the very least, he was much better than Su Wentian, and perhaps he wasn't inferior to Yang Yanzhou or Xin Zhao. Which one of these geniuses wasn't a proud and arrogant person? In public he would bow his head and apologize to a woman? But she had also seen many scenes. After a moment of surprise, the expression on her pretty face quickly returned to normal. She bowed slightly to Li Yi and said, "Since it was not intentional, there is no need to mention this matter in the future." Li Yi did not know that Zheng Zimo had already thought that what happened that day was only a misunderstanding. What she wanted was exactly Li Yi's attitude. Originally he thought that she would call him a lecher like before. Li Yi had already mentally prepared himself for this. He did not think that she would actually bow and return the greeting. It was clear that she did not intend to pursue the matter. "I wonder if you will participate in tomorrow's mid-autumn poetry meet?" At this time Zhao Yunru walked over and asked Li Yi with a smile. In Zhao Yunru's view, with the talent he had displayed today, if he could participate in the mid-autumn poetry meet, he would definitely shine. At that time, it would not be impossible for him to surpass Yang Yanzhou and Xin Zhao and obtain the title of the #1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. "To be honest, Miss Zhao, I have no interest in the poetry meet." Li Yi smiled and then raised his hands in a salute to the crowd. He said, "It's getting late. If there is nothing else, I will leave first." Hearing the first half of his words, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society were stunned. The poetry meet that they dreamed of participating in the eyes of the other, was not even worth mentioning. At this time, in Wan Ruoqing's mind, the image of him casually tossing Su Wentian's poem to the side floated up. Her heart suddenly felt relieved. This young master does things differently from normal scholars. He is most likely a noble person and does not care about empty reputation. Also, with his talent in poetry, he does not need to compete with others. As she thought this, she suddenly seemed to remember something. Her expression changed slightly. When she turned her head, the figure of the scholar and the servant girl had already disappeared through the door. "I was only thinking about the poem just now and forgot to ask for that young master's name," she exclaimed softly and hurriedly chased after them. After a moment, Wan Ruoqing stood on the street and looked at the bustling crowd. She could not see the end of the crowd. She gave a long sigh and turned to walk back. Chapter 78. Because of the poetry recital, they had wasted too much time. By the time Li Yi carried the servant girl back to the stockade village, the sun was already setting in the west. The servant girl's physical strength was much weaker. After walking for a day, she was so tired that she could not even walk when she was halfway back. At first, when Li Yi proposed to carry her on his back, the young maidservant kept on refusing. She gritted her teeth and walked a few steps, almost falling down. Li Yi did not allow her to say anything and lifted her up. The young girl resisted a few times but was unable to break free. She could only obediently adjust her posture and lay on his back. When Li Yi first came to this world, his body was still weak. However, Li Yi had been consciously training every day for the past 2 months. Recently, he had been learning martial arts from Lu Rui. Although he could only make a few good postures and was not very useful, his physique was obviously much stronger than before. At least, it was about the same as a normal person. Although the young girl's face was round and had some baby fat, she was petite and had a very slim figure. Li Yi did not feel that it was too heavy to carry her. Along the way he occasionally told some jokes which made the young girl giggle. Her body trembled on Li Yi's back. Sometimes she would interrupt and say a few words. Later on Li Yi did not speak much. He only listened to the servant girl talk non-stop. Of course, Xuanhuan did not have so many stories in her head. What she talked about was nothing more than things that happened when they were young. Xuanhuan and Lu's sister Rui grew up together. Naturally, they were part of the story. When she was alone with Li Yi, she did not have so many scruples when they spoke. Sometimes, she would unintentionally talk about some interesting things that happened between the two girls when they were young. For example, Second Miss was mischievous at that time. She did not practice martial arts properly and was punished by the master. She took a wooden sword and randomly slashed in the courtyard to vent her anger. She accidentally damaged the master's favorite flower. She threw the sword down and sat in the courtyard crying. Xuanhuan could not stop her, so the two of them cried together. Later on, eldest Miss took the initiative to tell Master that she was the one who damaged the flowers. Master punished her by locking her in the room to reflect on herself and forbade her from eating for a day. Xuanhuan and second Miss hid half a steamed bun each and passed it to her through the window. As she spoke, the young maidservant had a smile on her face. As she spoke, her voice grew softer and softer. It wasn't until Li Yi felt that the young maidservant's breathing had gradually steadied that he discovered that she had fallen asleep. In order not to wake up the servant girl, Li Yi slowed down his pace and tried his best not to shake. However, when he walked back to the stockade village, there was only a small amount of light in the sky. When he passed through the stockade and walked home, he bumped into the woman with the waist of a bucket. It was unknown if Lady Wu had done it intentionally or not, but when she brushed past Li Yi, her body suddenly tilted. Although Li Yi's physical strength had increased over the past few days, he was clearly at a disadvantage in terms of weight. He immediately staggered from the collision and managed to stabilize himself with great difficulty. However, the young maidservant on his back was startled awake. Madame Wu curled her lips, a mischievous smile on her face. "Son-in-law," she softly muttered a few words and rubbed her sleepy eyes. The small bundle on her arm fell to the ground, and when it landed, it scattered and a few silver ingots rolled out. It was a familiar scene. Madame Wu lowered her head to look at the silver ingots on the ground with a lifeless expression. The mischievous smile on her face had long disappeared. She couldn't suppress the impulse in her heart. She wanted to rush up and snatch the silver and run away, but in the end she couldn't turn her thoughts into reality before Li Yi picked up the silver. Even after Li Yi and Xuanhuan's figures disappeared and the sky had completely darkened, the woman with the waist of a bucket was still standing in the same place, as if she had become a statue. It was rare for him to wake up early. Li Yi pushed open the door and walked into the courtyard. He stretched his body. The weather had just entered autumn, so there wasn't much of a chill. The morning sun shone on his body, warm and comfortable. The sky was blue, and only a trace of clouds could be seen in the distant horizon. Although the air was fresh at this time, Li Yi couldn't help but miss the mellow haze of an ancient city in the northwest. However, in this life he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to smell that familiar smell again. The little maid came out of the inner courtyard and rubbed her sleepy eyes. She planned to wake the son-in-law up as usual. When she looked up, she was slightly stunned and then smiled. "Son-in-law, good morning." Standing in the courtyard, she watched the son-in-law slowly do a strange action, which didn't look like a martial arts move. After a while, the little maid went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Li Yi continued to do Tai Chi slowly, sorting out some things in his mind. The problem of the shop could now be solved. He could first release a small batch of floral dew and see the reaction of the market. As for the factory, it was time to start the construction. These things could be left to Fang and others. Li Yi couldn't intervene in the construction of the house, but the site had to be close to the water source. The layout of the room also needed to be discussed with Fang in advance. Other things couldn't be rushed for the time being. The road had to be taken step by step. Chapter 79. Even though they saw each other every day, Li Yi was still amazed by Lu Rui's beauty every time he saw her. She was as beautiful as the top actresses in the future. It was not an exaggeration to use more words to praise her beauty. In the Willow Leaf Village, even the naughty children who hadn't even grown up knew that they would marry a wife as beautiful as Sister Rui when they grew up, which showed how attractive she was to men. It had to be said that the old Lu family's genes were so good that they had no friends. Their daughters were each more beautiful than the other. Although Li Yi had never seen Lu Rui and her sister's parents, who were his in-laws in name, he knew that the two of them were definitely not bad-looking. Sometimes, Li Yi would even think that it was a blessing from God to make up for his accidental time travel. Was the beautiful woman in front of him really his wife? Although they hadn't had sex yet, they had bowed to heaven and earth. Even though Li Yi was still a single dog, in fact he didn't belong to this species anymore. He looked up at her and said with a smile, "This is called Tai Chi. When I was a child, I passed by an old Taoist in the village and taught me. He said that practicing Tai Chi could cultivate one's mind, strengthen one's body, and make one live to 100 years old. Do you want to learn it, my wife?" Lu Rui smiled and said, "My husband, you must be joking. Although Taoism is good at maintaining one's health, how many people have been able to live for more than 100 years since ancient times? In the stronghold, those who can live to 60 or 70 years old are already very rare. Even for martial artists like me who have a slightly longer lifespan, living to that age is already considered very fortunate. How could I dare to hope to live to 100 years old? Li Yi knew that what Lu Rui said was the truth. In this day and age, the medical level was extremely low. A common diarrhea or fever could kill people. The lack of hygiene awareness also made them more likely to get sick. The poor people couldn't even afford to see a doctor. If they could live to 40 or 50 years old, they would be lucky. It seemed like there was a need to teach those naughty children about hygiene. In the future, if anyone dared to urinate or defecate anywhere in the stockade village, the tools used to commit the crime would be confiscated. Lu Rui shook her head and thought that Li Yi was going to say something later. She changed the topic and said, "I've made a suit of clothes for you these days. Try it on and see if it fits you." Li Yi was slightly taken aback and was extremely surprised. Lu Rui actually made clothes for him? These days, although the two of them got along much better than before, it was not to this extent. Previously, when Lu Rui was teaching him martial arts, she was watching from the side and occasionally came up to give a few pointers. And when Li Yi was telling the story of the legend of the Condor heroes to Lu Rui and Xuanhuan, she would also quietly listen from the side, and after Li Yi was done she would give a few comments. For example, inner strength is actually not that powerful, the martial arts in the book compared to reality are a little exaggerated, and so on, but obviously she still liked listening to the stories that Li Yi told her. Li Yi would occasionally think about who was more powerful between the two sisters. He thought that it should be Rui, but it was not certain. If they were to fight, who would win? However, this thought had not been proven yet. But Rui was the older sister, so she should be more powerful, right? It was strange that the two sisters were born of the same mother, but their personalities were so different. Lu Rui was always cold and unapproachable, and anyone who looked at her would look like they were going to pull out a sword to kill someone. On the other hand, Lu Rui, other than being more powerful in martial arts, was more like a lady from a wealthy family. She was gentle and elegant, and would definitely be a good wife and mother in the future. If any man married her, he would be envied to death for the rest of his life. Thinking of this, even Li Yi was a little envious of himself. It was a moon-white robe. Although the fabric was ordinary, the stitches were fine. It was obvious that the person who sewed this robe had put a lot of effort into it. Before Li Yi practiced Tai Chi, he had already taken off his outer clothes. At this time he put it on and buttoned it up. The size was just right. He had a gentle and fair appearance. These days he had not neglected his training, so his body was no longer as weak as before. He could hold up the clothes. Under his scholarly appearance, there was a hint of masculinity. If he walked out with this temperament and recited a few lines, if two lovers love each other for a long time, why should they stay together day and night? Who knew how many women would go crazy for him? It fits perfectly. Thank you, my wife. A trace of undetectable emotion flashed in Li Yi's eyes as he looked at her and said. He could feel that Lu Rui no longer held the idea of using him as she had in the beginning. On the first night he was captured, Lu Rui had said that after a period of time, if he wanted to leave, he could do so at any time. Now, their status in the Willow Leaf village was no longer what it used to be. No one could force her to marry anyone. But regarding this matter, the two of them had a tacit understanding and did not mention it. In a short period of 2 months, the direct descendants of the Lu family were far more powerful than before. Even when Fang and the others faced the direct descendants, they could straighten their backs and speak loudly. "There's no need to be so polite, my husband." Lu Rui smiled and walked in front of him. She reached out and helped him with the top button of his robe. This was the first time Li Yi looked at her at such a close distance. Her beautiful face had never been so clear before. Lu Rui finished buttoning her robe. When she raised her head, the two of them looked into each other's eyes without any preparation. They saw their own reflections in each other's eyes. The expression on Lu Rui's pretty face froze. She suddenly remembered the scene of Xuanhuan happily reciting Li Yi's poem in front of her. Thinking of what the little servant girl said yesterday, her pretty face blushed slightly and she immediately averted her gaze. "Son-in-law, miss time to eat?" The little servant girl walked out of the kitchen. When she saw the two figures in the courtyard, a puzzled expression suddenly appeared on her pretty face. "Son-in-law and miss, what were they doing there?" "Mrs. Face, why was it so red?" When Li Yi was in the Willow Leaf village, he was basically isolated from the outside world. Naturally, he did not know what was happening in Qingyan Prefecture. On the day before the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, after a small-scale poetry meet, there were 2 Mid-Autumn Festival poems that spread at an astonishing speed. The Mid-Autumn Festival poem that was on the same level as the previous year's poetry meet quickly spread through the brothels and became known to even more people. And the Mid-Autumn Festival poem called drinking alone under the moon, stunned even more people. Who knew how many scholars recited, raising a cup to invite the bright moon, facing the shadows to form three people, while drinking and singing. They praised this poem as the first Mid-Autumn Festival poem in history. Of course, many of the talented women were more fond of the Mid-Autumn Festival poem called Remembering Your Charming Charm. In their hearts, they felt a bit of admiration for the scholar who had yet to reveal his name. Who knew how many people hoped that the nameless scholar would appear at the Mid-Autumn Festival poetry meet today and fight for the title of the #1 scholar with Yang Yanzhou and Xinzhao. And in the hearts of those who loved that poem, that person's poetic talent had long surpassed Yang Yanzhou and Xinzhao. After hearing that that person was actually related to the Yuning Poetry Society, within a day, the doorstep of the Poetry Society was almost trampled to pieces. Of course, regarding all of this, Li Yi was completely unaware. When he was in the kitchen preparing tonight's mid-autumn feast, he sneezed a few times and couldn't help but worry. Could it be that he caught a cold last night and caught a cold? Chapter 80. The Mid-Autumn Festival had always been a very elegant festival since ancient times. An incense burner table was set up in the courtyard, and on it were some fruits, pastries, mooncakes, snacks, and the like. 3 cups of light wine and 2 plates of side dishes would be gathered with the family, and they would toast to the moon. However, any kind of elegant atmosphere would always be destroyed when it came to Fang and the others. Even if it was as elegant as the Mid-Autumn Festival, it would also become unbearably vulgar. The sky was not dark yet, and a huge shed had been set up in the open space in front of Fang's house. Inside the shed, a huge pot was bubbling with hot steam. Fang stood on the table next to it, waving a huge spatula in his hand and stirring it with all his might. Inside the pot was half a fan of fresh pork that they had just bought today and some spare ribs. The fragrance of the meat permeated the air, and it could be smelled from afar. Originally they had planned to buy a whole pig, but after asking the price, Fang and the others discussed it, and they still bought half a fan of pork together. They had just gotten out of poverty and they wanted to save as much as possible. A few naughty children lingered outside the shed, and their eyes were fixed on the big pot, and their mouths kept swallowing saliva. Inside the shed, a few men sat around the table, and there were several freshly fried side dishes on the table. They picked up the muddy wine in the bowl and drank it all in one gulp. From time to time there would be hearty laughter. Fang let the wife at home take care of the meat. "Come over and drink with us." A strong man put down the wine bowl, looked in Fang's direction and said loudly, "You guys drink first, I'll be right there." Fang replied, but he did not put down the huge spatula in his hand. A trace of doubt appeared on the man's face and he muttered to himself, "What's wrong with Fang today? He usually runs faster than anyone else when he drinks, but he hasn't touched a single drop of wine today." A little further away, Fang wiped the sweat from his forehead, and he made up his mind that he would not go there tonight even if he died. Last time, he drank a bowl of wine from his son-in-law, and it made him lie in bed for a whole day. When he woke up, his head was so painful that it felt like it was going to explode. Thinking of that feeling, even though Fang was a man of indomitable spirit, he could not help but feel a little scared. He would not touch wine for a while. After a while, seeing that the meat in the pot was almost done cooking, old Fang waved his hand and called for everyone to come over. He filled everyone's bowl with a full bowl of meat soup, and naturally there was no lack of meat. When he turned around and saw a few naughty kids pacing back and forth outside, he called out to them from afar and waved them in. Every naughty kid got a bowl of soup. Although these children were the direct descendants of the Liu family, the grievances between the adults had nothing to do with the children. Fang was still very clear about this point. The few naughty children did not have time to say thank you when they got the benefits. They picked up the bowls and ran to the side. The boiling hot meat soup made them suck in air. They stretched out their dirty claws and took out a bone that had been cooked to crisp from the bowl. After tearing off the shredded meat on it, they ate it and even bit the bone to swallow it. These days no family had a good time. Even the direct descendants of the Liu family could not eat meat whenever they wanted. In today's village, only the Li Yi family, Fang, and the others could live such a comfortable life. The candied Ha's business had long been stabilized and there was a lot of income every day. Although Fang and the others did not eat so extravagantly, it was a bit unreasonable if they did not reward themselves during the festival. The Willow Leaf village was not small, but it was not too big either. The shed was open and there was such a big pot of meat being cooked. The smell could almost fill the entire village. Some people stood at the door of their houses and looked over with envious eyes. They could not help but gulp when they smelled the smell of the meat. Among these people, There was no lack of direct descendants of the Lu family. Do you think we should apologize to Rui and the others? Looking at the bustling scene as if it was New Year's Eve, a middle-aged man turned to look at another man beside him and said hesitantly, "Apologize for what?" The man was stunned and asked, "We have been too harsh to them in the past." The middle-aged man said with a complicated expression, "We are all uncles. You can put your face down but I can't." The man's expression changed and immediately said, "Face is nothing. Look at the Fong family now. They have meat to eat and wine to drink. Their lives are much better than ours." The expression on the middle-aged man's face was very envious. He continued, "I've asked around. Their candied haws business has a daily income. That's a lot of money. If we can also sell candied haws." Recently, the most uncomfortable thing for the Lu family was to find that the people they had never looked at before were all living better lives than them. They could drink big bowls of wine and eat big mouthfuls of meat while they could not even drink soup. As for comparing with Lu Rui and the others, these people had never thought about it. According to Madame Wu, every time Rui's son-in-law came back, he would bring a few hundred taels of silver with him. Those silver ingots were as big as a fist. It's not like you don't know that the secret recipe of the candied haws is in their hands. Now in the prefectural city, those people only recognize them for the candied haws business. We can't get involved at all unless they agree. If Rui agrees it will work. I'm not going to ask you to beg her. After saying this, the man flicked his sleeves and left. The middle-aged man stood there and sighed. He murmured, "I really can't bring myself to do this. Why don't I talk to second granduncle first?" Second granduncle's words, Rui should listen to him. He stood there in a daze for a long time. Just as he was about to turn around and go home, he suddenly saw the man come out of the house with something in his arms and hurriedly walk forward. "Where are you going?" The middle-aged man asked casually. It's not easy for Rui and her sister all these years. There are still a dozen eggs left at home. I'm going to send them to nourish their bodies. The man's voice came from the dark night. The figure gradually walked away, leaving the middle-aged man standing there with a stunned expression, alone in the night wind. In the small courtyard, Li Yi was explaining to Xuanhuan and Sister Rui that there was no Chang'e, no osmanthus tree, no Wu Gang, and of course no jade rabbit on the moon. The courtyard they were in was hundreds of thousands of miles away from the moon. The moon itself did not emit light. The moonlight they were seeing now was actually sunlight? The little servant girl never doubted Li Yi's words. After listening to him, she was obviously a little sad that Chang'e and Jade Rabbit were not on the moon. Lu Rui had never believed that there was Chang'e and Jade Rabbit on the moon. That was something that only young girls believed in. However, she was skeptical of Li Yi's words that the moon did not emit light and what they were seeing now was actually sunlight. It was not that she did not believe it at all. Although this sounded a little unbelievable, compared to this, Lu Rui felt that it was even more unbelievable that two rocks of different sizes would fall from the same height and land at the same time. Since such a thing could happen, what else was impossible? As for Lu Rui, she only listened quietly. Although she also had doubts in her heart, she did not ask. She patiently waited for Li Yi's explanation. Li Yi was just about to explain to them the principle of the moon reflecting sunlight when there was a sudden knock on the door. Just now it was eggs and mooncakes. What is it this time? A puzzled expression appeared on his face. He was greatly surprised. Could it be that this world had a tradition of sending warmth during the Mid-Autumn Festival? Chapter 81. Even if there was a tradition of sending warmth to the Mid-Autumn Festival in this world, it shouldn't be the direct descendants of the Lu family who still had grudges with them. Li Yi remembered that when he first came to the village, these people didn't need to look at him directly. But just now they deliberately flattered him, which made him feel comfortable. Since they came with gifts, Li Yi naturally could not put on a cold face. No matter what they brought, he accepted it all. And when the other party was hesitating as if he wanted to say something, he smiled and asked Xuanhuan to send them off. Li Yi naturally knew what they were thinking. Seeing that Fang and the others were living better and better lives, it would be strange if these people didn't envy them. However, if they didn't spit out all the things they ate from Sister Rui these years, there was no room for negotiation. Li Yi's attitude also made these people realize that it was impossible to get the benefits they wanted with just a few eggs, a few mooncakes, or a few words of apology. They needed to show more sincerity. For the people of the Lu family who were sad for Lu's sister Rui, there was not a moment when they regretted more than now. What they lost now was far more than what they took from the two sisters. It was not easy to popularize modern scientific knowledge to the people of this era. Some principles could be explained through simple experiments, but things that were not easy to verify were not so easy to accept. For example, whether it was Lu's sister Rui or Xuanhuan, they couldn't understand what Li Yi said. They started from Willow Village and kept walking forward, and one day they would return to the village. When Li Yi used a big ball as a metaphor for the world they lived in, even the little servant girl couldn't help laughing. "Young master, if we live on a big ball, then won't the people living below fall down?" Even the little servant girl who trusted Li Yi to the extreme couldn't understand this matter. Speaking of this, Li Yi realized that it was time to end the knowledge popularization tonight. If he continued to explain, he might have to talk about gravity or the rotation of the Earth. Was the planet under their feet called the Earth? This was something that Li Yi could not prove. But here, all the natural laws of the original world were also applicable. The sunrise and sunset, the 24 hours of the day, the 24 solar terms, and other aspects should be the same. It was somewhat similar to the parallel space theory of the future, but whether it was true or not was no longer important to him. After dinner, he walked out of the courtyard. When he reached the door, he smelled the fragrance of meat that had yet to dissipate. Fong and those fellows were too high profile. With such great fanfare, were they not afraid of attracting the wolves in the back mountain? Speaking of which, it was the night of the full moon. The possibility of this happening was very high. He had to remind Xuanhuan to close the door at night. As he thought of this, he saw a few sturdy figures walking over. Son-in-law. Fong was quite surprised to meet Li Yi and immediately greeted him. "Where are you going?" Li Yi asked curiously. "We plan to go down the mountain tonight and walk around the prefectural city," Fong replied with a smile. "It's so late, going to the prefectural city?" Li Yi was even more puzzled. Seeing Fong and the others sneaking around, the smiles on their faces seemed to reveal a sense of lasciviousness. Li Yi looked at them and said, "Could it be that you are going to a brothel?" The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. Fong looked honest, but he was always thinking about earning money to marry a mistress. He was the type of person who was extremely coquettish on the inside. But the strange thing was that he was not afraid of his wife at home today. Fong looked at Li Yi and said righteously, "Son-in-law, the prefectural city is very lively on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival. We are just going down the mountain to take a look. Son-in-law, don't sully our innocence." Fong's words made Li Yi want to slap him. He was clearly uncultured, but he still wanted to learn from scholars and speak in a genteel manner. Yet he always expressed the wrong meaning, sully his innocence. This scene stung his eyes just thinking about it. Moreover, where did this guy get his innocence from? We are all men, so I can understand. But this kind of thing needs to be restrained. Don't be carried out of the jade yard tomorrow. Although Fong looked like a dragon and a tiger, who knew if he was as strong as he looked in that aspect? Li Yi kindly reminded him. "Son-in-law, how do you know about the jade yard?" Fong looked at Li Yi and asked with a puzzled expression. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, then a smile appeared on his face. He looked up at the sky and couldn't help but exclaim, "The moon tonight is not bad. The moon is so big and round." Fong, after being stunned for a moment, he could only laugh dryly and say, "Yes, the moon is so big and round today." He sighed with emotion at the mid-autumn moon and suddenly felt a surge of talent in his heart. He almost wanted to recite a poem, but Fong stopped himself in time. He turned to look at Li Yi and said, "Son-in-law, do you want to go down with us to take a look? The busiest days of the year in the prefectural city are the mid-autumn and the upper prime period. Don't worry if you want to go to the jade yard, we will definitely not tell eldest miss when we come back." Fong and the others looked at each other and revealed a smile that all men understood. To be honest, Li Yi was really moved by Fong's words. In this era, one couldn't watch TV or watch movies or even play with mobile phones. There was really no entertainment to pass the time. It was even more so in the stockade outside the prefectural city. After dark, people could only go to bed early. Li Yi was very curious about what the nightlife of the people in the city was like. On account of old Fong's sincere invitation, he reluctantly accompanied them for a stroll. Of course, it was fine to go to the jade yard. It was the first time in 2 lifetimes and he couldn't give it away so carelessly. Moreover, he and Zheng Zimo were considered acquaintances. If he ran into her, how awkward would it be? He could consider going to other brothels. Under the condition of keeping his bottom line, he could properly experience the ancient culture. Going out with Fong and the others in the middle of the night, his sense of security suddenly increased a lot. He was about to go back and say hello to Lu Rui and the others, but when he turned around he found that the woman with the sword was leaning against a willow tree behind him, looking at them with interest. "Hello, second miss." Fong had an extremely simple and honest expression on his face. He greeted Lu Rui, but there was a trace of an imperceptible smirk at the corner of his mouth. Seeing his sister-in-law behind him, Li Yi suddenly had a few black lines on his face. He had actually been tricked by this idiot Fong. He must have remembered that he had been beaten up by his sister-in-law 2 times before. He had already seen Lu Rui just now and deliberately said those words to lure him. Was this still the King simple and honest Fong? Chapter 82. After seeing the Qing and Prefecture city on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Li Yi finally understood that Fong was right. Before this, he had never thought that the nightlife of the ancient people could be so rich. The streets of the Qing and Prefecture city were as lively as the extremely prosperous night markets of the later generations. The entire street was brightly lit, and the main street, which was several feet wide, was unusually crowded. It was difficult for carriages and horses to move. There was an endless stream of pedestrians, and hawkers with their shoulders on their shoulders came and went. All kinds of hawking sounds could be heard. After walking for a short distance, Li Yi already saw a few hawkers selling candied haws. Their business was unusually good. If Fong and the others saw this, they would probably die of heartache. Tonight's business was probably equivalent to 10 days or half a month's worth of business. Thinking of Fong, Li Yi couldn't help but feel a few black lines appear on his face. Men become bad when they become rich. This saying was used in both ancient and modern times. Now that Fong's wallet was bulging, even his personality had changed a lot. Who knew where the honest man who couldn't bear to eat the pheasant he hunted and wanted to give it to Lu's sister Rui had gone? In such a short period of time, he had become a sinister, cunning, and shameless person. Li Yi turned to look at Rui, who was following him and looking at the night market with interest. In his heart, he had already made up his mind to let Fong do the most difficult and tiring work for a period of time in the future. If it wasn't for Fong, the current him would probably be free and unfettered. Perhaps he could really go to a brothel and experience the splendid culture of the ancient times. Of course, this was just an assumption. Although it was a little exciting to bring his sister-in-law to a brothel, before this, Li Yi couldn't guarantee that Lu Rui wouldn't put his sword in a wrong place. Fong and the others were clever. The moment they entered the prefecture city, they found an excuse to slip away, leaving this big trouble to Li Yi. Of course, Li Yi also rejected this in his heart. However, ever since they entered the city, Lu Rui had been following behind him without any intention of leaving. He couldn't get rid of him no matter what. Rui, why don't I give you a few taels of silver and you can walk around by yourself? The feeling of being watched by others did not feel good. Li Yi finally could not hold it in any longer. He turned his head to look at Lu Rui and gave a very constructive suggestion. Lu Rui turned her head to look at him. There was no expression on her face, nor did she speak. However, the look in her eyes made Li Yi feel a little diffident. Moments later, Li Yi waved his hand helplessly. Forget it. Follow me if you want to. With such a tough sister-in-law around, it would be impossible to experience the brothel culture with a learning attitude. Li Yi gave up on this idea and walked along the street in boredom. Only the street sideshow could pique his interest. Just when he was about to go over to take a look, someone suddenly patted his back. Li Yi turned his head and was slightly taken aback. A look of surprise appeared on his face. Brother Li, it's really you. Seeing Li Yi here, the handsome young man opposite him was also very surprised and said with a slightly surprised tone. Little. Haha, Brother Li, what a coincidence. Li Yi didn't expect to meet the little prince of Ningguang Mansion here. He had just said one word when he remembered that he had told others not to call him that, so he changed his words. This lady is Brother Li's wife? The little prince, Li Xian, looked around and saw Lu Rui standing at the side. A trace of surprise flashed in his eyes and he blurted out. No, Brother Li has misunderstood. This is my wife's sister. Li immediately explained. Whoever married Lu Rui was really tired of living. He wasn't that stupid. Wife's sister. Li Xian heard it and was stunned at first. Then a strange smile appeared on his face. He looked at Li Yi with a look that all men understood. He then patted his shoulder and said, Brother Li is really capable. I admire you. Li Yi was stunned for a while before he understood Li Xian's meaning. When he looked at him again, the look in his eyes changed. This guy, is he really a little prince? Or were all the little princes of ancient times this kind of filthy people? Lu Rui didn't understand Li Xian's words at first. But seeing the expression on his face, she seemed to have thought of something. Her pretty face turned cold and one hand was already on the hilt of her sword. A faint murderous aura emanated from her delicate body. At the same time, the expressions of the two men dressed as manservants standing behind Li Xian suddenly changed. They took a step forward and stood in front of Li Xian, reaching for their waists. "What are you doing?" Li Xian looked at the two people who suddenly became nervous and asked in confusion. The murderous aura collided and swords were drawn. Seeing this, Li Yi's heart skipped a beat. This little prince could flirt with anyone, but he actually flirted with this demoness. If he really angered her, she would chop him like a tree trunk. That night in Qing and Prefecture would be very lively. From then on, he could only flee to the ends of the world with the two sisters and Xuanhuan. They would find a hidden place to hide for the rest of their lives. The three of them would live together. Thinking about it, this kind of life seemed to be quite happy. No, if they ran away, Fong and all the people in Willow Leaf Village would not be able to run away. At that time, they might become the scapegoats. After all, murder was a serious crime, not to mention that it was a relative of the emperor. The consequences of this sword were too serious. Before Lu Rui drew out her sword, Li Yi quickly pressed her hand. "Don't be impulsive, don't be impulsive. We are all on the same side." Lu Rui's delicate body shook. She looked down at the hand held by Li Yi, and her eyes emitted a dangerous aura again. At this time, the way Li Xian looked at Li Yi was even more different. Although they all had the surname Li, this brother Li's behavior was obviously more eccentric. He had touched his sister-in-law's hand in the street, and he still said that there was no adultery between them? But this matter was soon forgotten by him. He pulled Li Yi's sleeve and said, "Let's not talk about this first. Let's go, I will take you to a fun place." Hearing Li Xian said fun place, Li Yi immediately thought of something. He looked serious and said righteously, "Brother Li, who do you think I am? How can I go to that kind of place of prostitution?" When he spoke, he secretly glanced at Lu Rui, and the awe-inspiring qi on his body became stronger. "Brother Li, you misunderstood. This time we are not going to the Jade Yard. You will know the specific place in a while." Li Xian explained. Alas, what a stupid teammate. Feeling two cold eyes falling on his back, Li Yi sighed in his heart and thought with great melancholy. He had been cheated twice in a row. He was afraid that he could no longer avoid going to the Jade Yard. Chapter 83. The lights that lit up the entire night reflected the extreme prosperity of the prefectural city on the night of mid-autumn. No matter where one went, there was a bustling and noisy atmosphere. Somewhere in the bustling area of the city, there was a vast and luxurious manor. Scholars and scholars with feather fans and silk handkerchiefs floated in the wind. As they chatted and laughed, new poems flowed out. After a few paper rafts were sent out, not long after, there were professional singers in the garden. Very quickly they would sing the poem in a mellow voice and leave it for everyone to judge. On the opposite side there were all women. They were all the daughters of the large families in the prefectural city. Occasionally they would sneak a glance across and cover their handkerchiefs with a light smile. They would sneak a glance at the scholars they liked. If a paper raft with a poem was sent over, a few of them would gather together and comment on it. As the daughters of families with a bit of status in the city, they generally knew a bit of poetry. At this time, in a pavilion in a remote corner of the garden, the atmosphere was slightly cold. A young girl of 16 or 17 sat at a stone table in the pavilion with one hand propping up her chin. She looked at the figures coming and going in front of her. Her expression was a bit bored. After a while, she turned her head and said to the women in the pavilion, "This mid-autumn poetry meet is not fun at all." Hearing this, the women looked at each other speechlessly. Today this garden was hosting the mid-autumn poetry meet, not the mid-autumn temple fair. Even if they randomly stopped anyone on the road, they could be a famous scholar in Qingyan Prefecture. Everyone was here to exchange pointers and make friends through literature, not to have fun. If a scholar was not famous enough, he wouldn't even have the right to participate in the poetry meet. This invitation from the Yunying Poetry Society had been obtained after many twists and turns. "Sister Yunro, is the scholar you were talking about coming tonight?" The young girl who spoke was not a member of the Yunying Poetry Society. She had only asked Zhao Yunru to bring her to watch because there was an extra invitation. However, reality was different from what she had imagined. This mid-autumn poetry meet was not as fun as she had imagined. She asked Zhao Yunru, still thinking about a certain scholar that her sisters could not forget. Zhao Yunru shook her head with a bitter smile. They never had much hope that they would be able to see Li Yi from the immortal Magpie Bridge here. Participating in this kind of poetry gathering was probably just an opportunity to broaden their horizons. As expected, the young master from yesterday did not come today, one of the young girls in the pavilion said. Putting aside the scholar who only existed in legends, The nameless scholar who had helped them qualify for the poetry meet yesterday was not seen either. That young master must really be indifferent to fame and fortune. He didn't even accept the invitation yesterday. It seems that he has no interest in this poetry meet, Xuanhuan said after thinking for a while. Until now, she still felt a little regretful that she had forgotten to ask for the young master's name yesterday. With the other's talent in poetry, he was definitely not a nameless person in Qing and Fu. However, after Xuanhuan investigated each and every one of the scholars who were worthy of that level of talent, she still did not find any. He was like Li Yi of Immortal Magpie Bridge. He had only left behind poems, but he was nowhere to be seen. This caused countless scholars to daydream. If he could come, perhaps things would not be so boring right now. At least in name he was still a member of the Yunning Poetry Society. In today's poetry meet, the position of the Yunning Poetry Society was actually quite awkward. Even though they all had the reputation of being talented, there was still a large gap between them and the upper-class scholars. They had no way of fitting into their circle. Even the prefectural magistrate of Qing'an Prefecture would make a brief appearance at the poetry meet, much less the first and second scholars. In the past, they would never have had the chance to interact with these people. Even the most famous of them all, Xuanhuan, only had the reputation of being a talented woman in a small circle. Tonight's mid-autumn poetry meet was of a much higher standard. Even their seats were arranged to be in such a remote place. And in the center of the garden was a waterside pavilion. Many famous scholars gathered there. This was the true heart of the poetry meet. All the masterpieces that appeared in the poetry meet would eventually be gathered here. The people who commented here were all extremely important scholars, or people of virtue and prestige, or people of high status. Of course, the poetry meet did not only consist of reciting poems. Singers and dancers could be seen everywhere. Their voices were melodious and their movements were moving. Most of what they sang was the work that had appeared tonight. If there was a good piece, it would quickly be sent out of the garden. Before long, people in the brothels of the city would receive the news and sing out the new work. Ordinary scholars who did not have the right to enter the meet would mostly gather at such a place. They would not miss out on the works of the meet. Poetry meets of all sizes were not rare in the prefectural city tonight. If there were a few outstanding works, they could be sent to the garden to be judged alongside the works of the scholars. Of course, a masterpiece of this level was extremely rare and hard to come by every year. An elegant atmosphere spread throughout the city. At this time, the mid-autumn poetry meet was already halfway through. Qin Yang's performance tonight was average. Even though it was average, there was not much that stood out. It is indeed surprising. Husband Qin's mid-autumn poetry is not bad. Last year it was in the top 10. I'm afraid it will be difficult to make it today. Qin Yui's poem is not bad. The idea is new and unexpected. It can be considered a rare piece of work. Not bad. With his standard in the past, to be able to write a poem of this level is already very rare. In the middle of the waterside pavilion, in a much wider pavilion, a few scholars were evaluating the poems of the night. They were all scholars that were well known in Qing'an Prefecture. Although their opinions did not represent authority, they still had great value as a reference. Beside them, a slender figure leaned against the railing by the water. He held a wine cup in his hand and raised his head to look at the bright moon in the sky. He drank the wine in the cup in one gulp. He couldn't help but murmur, "I raise my cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. What's wrong with Brother Yanzhou today? Why isn't he saying anything?" One of the scholars raised his head and looked in a certain direction. A trace of confusion flashed across his face. The other was publicly recognized as the #1 scholar of Qing'an. His poetry was flourishing and few could compare. Other than Xin Zhao, who could compete with him for the title of champion of the meet, there was no one else who could rival him. Even Xin Zhao could not compare to Yang Yanzhou in terms of mid-autumn poetry. Although he had not yet produced a poem, he had more or less secured the title of champion. But looking at it now, he did not seem to be in high spirits. You're tuning in to this Sword Dance in the Vast Sky YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.